farmers are voicing frustrations over the Trump administration's use of tariffs.
I don't see that happening unless this tariff thing gets worked out by really next month or even October.
America's Corn Belt was supposed to be untouchable, the breadbasket of the world, feeding nations and securing influence. But in 2025, that illusion shattered. One by one, 7 of Washington's most reliable buyers, Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Japan, and China, turned their backs on U.S. corn and signed historic contracts with Canada. Not next year, not next decade, this year, right now. The reason? Volatility. America's farmers worked the fields, but Washington's politics poisoned the deals. Tariffs, trade wars, shipment delays. The world got tired of gambling on uncertainty. Canada stepped in with stable pricing, blockchain tracking, and politically neutral supply chains. Suddenly, America's dominance collapsed into a generational crisis, and Canada became the trusted supplier. This isn't just about corn, it's about power. And what comes next will shock every farmer, trader, and policymaker. Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep watching. The story of America's corn collapse doesn't begin in Beijing or Tokyo. It begins in Cairo. Egypt was the first domino to fall, and the moment it did, the rest of the world started watching closely. For decades, Egypt relied heavily on U.S. corn to feed its population and keep bread prices under control. But in 2025, the Egyptian government made a stunning announcement. They were canceling a long-standing U.S. contract and signing an $847 million deal with Canada instead. The reason was simple: reliability. Egypt couldn't afford to have cargo ships delayed because of Washington's latest tariff tantrum or to pay inflated prices triggered by a midnight trade war tweet. Canada promised fixed contracts, transparent digital tracking of shipments, and political neutrality. To Cairo, that meant stability. And when it comes to food security, stability is worth more than loyalty. America lost not just a buyer, but the perception of being dependable. But Egypt was only the start, because just weeks later, South Korea made its move. Seoul's frustration had been building for years. Korean importers were forced to deal with outdated U.S. documentation systems, paper-based, slow, and riddled with errors. Every shipment involved unnecessary costs, red tape, and delays. Canada, by contrast, offered a 21st-century solution: blockchain-verified corn supply. With Canada's system, South Korean buyers could track every grain in real time, cutting processing times by 34% and eliminating disputes over quality. The switch wasn't just about convenience. It was about modernization. South Korea is a global tech hub. To them, U.S. bureaucracy felt like doing business with the last century. Canada's precision agriculture and digital transparency fit seamlessly with Korea's innovation-driven economy. It's no wonder Seoul shifted billions in trade to Canadian fields, and once again, American farmers paid the price. Then came Vietnam. For Hanoi, the issue wasn't paperwork. It was survival in the middle of a geopolitical storm. Vietnam's booming aquaculture industry depends on cheap and steady corn supplies for feed. But because of the U.S. China trade war, Vietnam's corn contracts were constantly disrupted. Prices swung wildly. Shipments were delayed. At one point, Vietnamese producers faced near collapse because Washington and Beijing were trading tariffs like artillery shells. Canada offered Vietnam what the U.S. no longer could: insulation from volatility, fixed pricing, reliable scheduling, and neutrality in the middle of great power politics. By 2025, nearly 89% of Vietnam's corn imports came from Canada, not the United States. That shift delivered a 23% boost in Vietnam's aquaculture productivity. And as fish farms thrived, America's export terminals stood quiet, with unsold grain piling up like an abandoned harvest. But the biggest statement of independence came from Saudi Arabia. For Riyadh, food security isn't just an economic concern, it's a national security priority. Saudi leaders watched the chaos of U.S. politics and decided they couldn't anchor their survival to Washington's volatility. They invested $2.3 billion directly into Canadian grain infrastructure, building silos, logistics centers, and dedicated shipping lanes to ensure their supply was guaranteed. By 2025, 67% of Saudi Arabia's imported grain came from Canada, bypassing U.S. influence altogether. This wasn't just commerce. It was strategy. By aligning with Canada, Saudi Arabia ensured its food chain was insulated from U.S. political pressure. For Washington, the message was clear. If America weaponizes trade, the world will find alternatives. And they did, faster than anyone in the U.S. establishment imagined. Each of these defections, Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, carried its own logic. But together, they painted a devastating picture. America's corn exports weren't just shrinking. They were collapsing. Farmers in the Midwest watched as silos filled with unsold grain. Phones stopped ringing. International buyers that had once been guaranteed customers were gone, and they weren't coming back. For generations, U.S. agriculture was the envy of the world. The phrase, "feed the planet," was practically stitched into the American flag. But in 2025, that identity crumbled. Canada, with smaller acreage but sharper strategy, seized the moment. Ottawa's approach was simple: offer stability, embrace technology, and stay politically neutral. That formula won over buyers who had grown tired of Washington's chaos. And yet, as dramatic as these first 4 defections were, they were only half the story. Because if losing Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia hurt, the next wave of defections would leave Washington reeling. America's own neighbor would betray it. Japan, one of its closest allies, would defect. And finally, the single biggest buyer of all, China, would deliver the knockout blow. But that wasn't the whole story. The most painful betrayal was still to come. If the defections of Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia rattled Washington, the next 3 broke its spirit. Because what came next wasn't just about foreign buyers leaving. It was about betrayal, humiliation, and a fundamental collapse of trust in America's agricultural dominance. The most painful defection came from across the border, Mexico. For over a century, the United States and Mexico built an agricultural relationship that was considered unshakable. Millions of tons of U.S. corn flowed south every year, feeding tortilla factories, livestock operations, and the daily diets of over 120 million people. This wasn't just trade. It was dependency. But in 2025, that bond cracked. A series of political disputes between Washington and Mexico City led to delayed shipments at the border. Trucks were held up for weeks. Farmers in Mexico watched livestock starve. Tortilla producers lost money daily. By the time the crisis ended, Mexico had lost $340 million. The damage wasn't just economic, it was personal. Mexico felt abandoned. And when Canada offered guaranteed supply with digital contracts and faster delivery routes, Mexico accepted. For Washington, the betrayal was devastating. To lose a neighbor, a partner, and one of its closest allies, it revealed the depth of the crisis. Then came Japan. If Mexico's defection was betrayal, Japan's was humiliation. Tokyo is famous for its uncompromising standards. Every grain of corn must be consistent, predictable, and precisely delivered. U.S. farmers once had the reputation for meeting those standards. But in recent years, Japan complained about shipment inconsistencies, pricing games, and delays tied to Washington's political brinkmanship. Canada, however, gave Japan exactly what it wanted: precision agriculture, predictive delivery systems, blockchain-backed compliance that guaranteed every shipment was flawless. By 2025, Canada captured 67% of Japan's corn imports. For Japanese industries, especially the world-famous Wagyu beef producers who demanded perfect feed, Canada's consistency was priceless. For America, it was a humiliation. The country once trusted to feed the planet could no longer guarantee a shipment without political baggage. But the final blow came from the largest buyer of them all, China. Beijing had long been America's single most valuable corn customer. But it was also the most vulnerable to politics. Every U.S. China dispute, from tariffs to sanctions, rippled through the corn trade. Farmers in Iowa and Illinois lived and died by the swings of the trade war. By 2025, China decided enough was enough. In a historic move, Beijing signed a deal with Canada for 5.7 million tons of corn annually, bypassing U.S. supply chains entirely. But it wasn't just about the numbers. China also embraced new Arctic shipping routes. cutting weeks off delivery times and avoiding US-controlled choke points. The symbolism was unmistakable. China didn't just replace US corn. It rewired the global supply chain to ensure America couldn't hold leverage over it again. The consequences were immediate. US corn exports to China plummeted by 78%. Silos across the Midwest overflowed with grain no one wanted. Farmers faced financial ruin. Small towns dependent on agriculture saw jobs vanish. For decades, politicians had promised that America's breadbasket would always keep the nation powerful. But now, that breadbasket was rotting. And China wasn't done. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing began encouraging other nations to adopt Canada's agricultural model. Contracts signed in Africa and Southeast Asia mirrored the Canadian style: transparent, tech-driven, and politically neutral. The ripple effects were massive. America's influence in global food markets shrank almost overnight. Canada wasn't just winning contracts. It was exporting a system, one that cut Washington out of the loop. Think about the scale of this collapse. 7 countries: Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Japan, and China. Together, they represented the backbone of U.S. corn exports. And in less than a year, they were gone. Each had its own reasons, from paperwork to politics, from precision to price. But the common thread was undeniable. The world no longer trusted America to deliver food without drama. Canada, with fewer resources but sharper execution, proved that trust travels faster than grain. By leaning on stability, digital transparency, and neutrality, Ottawa positioned itself as the supplier of choice for a hungry world. Meanwhile, U.S. farmers, the backbone of the Midwest, were left watching their futures evaporate. Fields still grew corn, but the markets were gone. This was more than an economic setback. It was a generational loss of dominance. For decades, U.S. leaders treated agriculture as an afterthought in foreign policy, assuming buyers would always come back. In 2025, they learned the hard truth. Once trust is broken, it doesn't return. And yet, even as the scale of this crisis became undeniable, Washington remained slow to react. Politicians downplayed the defections. Officials called them temporary, but farmers on the ground knew better. When your silos are full, when your contracts are gone, when your neighbors stop calling, that's not temporary. That's collapse. But that wasn't the end. Because beyond the numbers, beyond the contracts, lay a far more troubling reality. The world was no longer waiting for America. Canada had rewritten the rules of agricultural power. And if Washington couldn't adapt, it wasn't just corn that would slip away. It was America's role in the global food chain itself. 7 nations walking away in 1 year wasn't just a trade shift. It was a global earthquake. Egypt, South Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Japan, and China, all gone, all placing their bets on Canada's stability while America's exports crumbled. The U.S. Corn Belt, once the pride of the Midwest, is now facing overflowing silos, bankrupt farmers, and communities on edge. This isn't just about corn. It's about power, credibility, and America's place in the global food chain. If Washington can't adapt, if it keeps gambling with tariffs and politics, then this collapse will spread to wheat, soy, beef, and beyond. Canada isn't just filling the gap, it's building a new order. So the question isn't whether America lost buyers. The question is whether America just lost its future. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit like, smash subscribe, and stay tuned for what comes next.